Gestures that accompany speech are an essential part of natural and efficient embodied human communication. The automatic generation of such co-speech gestures is a long-standing problem in computer animation and is considered an enabling technology for creating believable characters in film, games, and virtual social spaces, as well as for interaction with social robots. The problem is made challenging by the idiosyncratic and non-periodic nature of human co-speech gesture motion, and by the great diversity of communicative functions that gestures encompass. The field of gesture generation has seen surging interest in the last few years, owing to the emergence of more and larger datasets of human gesture motion, combined with strides in deep learning-based generative models in general, that benefit from the growing availability of data. This review article summarizes co-speech gesture generation research, with a particular focus on deep generative models. First, we articulate the theory describing human gesticulation and how it complements speech. Next, we briefly discuss rule-based and classical statistical gesture synthesis, before delving into deep learning approaches. We employ the choice of input modalities as an organizing principle, examining systems that generate gestures from audio, text and non-linguistic input. Concurrent with the exposition of deep learning approaches, we chronicle the evolution of the related training data sets in terms of size, diversity, motion quality, and collection method, for example, optical motion capture or pose estimation from video. Finally, we identify key research challenges in gesture generation, including data availability and quality, producing human-like motion, grounding the gesture in the co-occurring speech in interaction with other speakers, and in the environment, performing gesture evaluation, and integration of gesture synthesis into applications. We highlight recent approaches to tackling the various key challenges, as well as the limitations of these approaches, and point toward areas of future development. 1. Introduction. This paper summarizes research on the synthesis of gesture motion, with a particular emphasis on more recent techniques using deep learning. The focus is on co-verbal gesture, gesture that accompanies speech. When considering the problem, a first reasonable question is why should we care about gesture at all? Gesture plays at least three main functions. First, and most simply, it helps artificial agents and robots look more alive and be more engaging. Second, it communicates functional information. This can include pointing or deictic gesture that establish reference, emblems that replace words, and imagistic metaphoric and iconic gestures that illustrate concepts and artifacts. Third, gesture communicates social information, including personality, and they communicate differently than spoken language. Gestures communicate particularly directly when being used to describe spatial concepts or object manipulation because there is a natural iconicity to these concepts, which is well portrayed in gestures. Gesture permits the speaker to represent ideas that are compatible with its mimetic and analog format, for example, shapes, sizes, spatial relationships, ideas that may be less compatible with the discrete and categorical format underlying speech. Thus, when it accompanies speech, gesture allows speakers to convey thoughts that may not easily fit into the categorical system that their spoken language offers. Of 20 experiments showed that the gesture already present in pedagogical agents is beneficial for student learning, with positive effects on transfer of knowledge, retention of learning and agent persona, but not on reducing cognitive load. Given the potential value of nonverbal communication, the question remains as to how to synthesize appropriate behavior in our computational systems. Formally, the problem is to generate an input-to-output mapping, where the input is some representation of the content, and the output is some representation of the behavior. Most learning systems to date have assumed audio and/or text as the input, although we will see this has limitations. The output is generally either frames of pose data or a lexicalized representation of the gestures that should appear, for example. Accompany this sentence with a conduit gesture that displays the idea of conveying something to the interlocutor. The latter must then be converted to animation using some secondary system. Previous surveys have covered co-speech gesture synthesis with varying scope and emphasis. Is more closely related to our work, emphasizing co-verbal gesture generation for virtual agents and robots. Their work presents a scoping review of data-driven techniques for speech-to-gesture generation, related datasets, and evaluation metrics. We include a larger set of papers, 40 versus 19, and are able to provide a more in-depth treatment of the technical material given the substantially longer star format. Overall, our survey makes the following contributions to the field. A detailed discussion on the theory and motivation for co-verbal gesture synthesis. A discussion on rule-based and statistical techniques, illustrating how these approaches can complement the strengths and weaknesses of recent deep learning approaches. An emphasis on deep learning-based generation systems using input modality as an organizing principle for the research. A discussion on the most commonly used speech-to-gesture datasets, collected via motion capture or pose estimation. Identifying and detailing a set of key challenges for co-verbal gesture synthesis and potential research directions. The remainder of the paper begins by providing a deeper background on gesture, followed by a summary of synthesis techniques that have been developed to date and concludes with a discussion of major open problems. 2. Human gesticulation. Manual gestures are non-verbal, non-manipulative hand/arm movements that occur during speech. We will refer to manual gestures as simply gestures in this work, although gestures can in general be performed by other body parts, such as the head. Gestures aid in the communicative intent and are closely linked to accompanying speech in terms of timing, meaning and communicative function. For instance, gestures can be used for pointing to resolve references to objects, what is that, or illustrate concepts that would otherwise be difficult to explain verbally. Where gesture categories are sorted in increasing lexicalization, that is the degree to which they adhere to formal, language-like grammatical rules, as illustrated in Figure 2. In this framework, the least lexicalized, conversational gesture, have obligatory speech, while the fully lexicalized, sign language, have little or no obligatory speech as the gestures themselves gain explicit lexical properties. Most importantly, the fully lexicalized end of the spectrum, sign languages, have formal syntactic structure like spoken languages, but this is absent from co-verbal gesticulations. This lack of structure is one of the challenges in producing co-verbal gesture as the behavior can be highly idiosyncratic. There are many different forms of gesture and McNeill argues, for a dimensional view in which the dimensions are iconic, images of the concrete, metaphoric, images of the abstract, deictic, pointing, and beat, flicks of the hand in time to rhythm of the speech. An iconic gesture might show the size of a box being discussed by drawing it in space, whereas a metaphoric gesture might indicate an abstract concept, such as all ideas are included, by making an umbrella shape. A given gesture may load on multiple of these dimensions, for example displaying both iconicity and deixis. An additional category are adapters, or self-adapters, which are self-manipulations, such as scratching one's nose or bracing fingers. These are not designed to communicate, but do convey information about personality. 3. Approaches for gesture synthesis. Synthesizing co-speech gestures is essential for creating interactive and believable virtual characters in human-computer interaction, HCI, graphics and social robotics. Thus significant effort has been applied and progress has been made for applications in virtual agents, and deep symbolic representations were used to encode timing, intonation and the corresponding gesture prototypes. The gesture prototypes were used to perform the full gesture. The result was agents with appropriate and well-synchronized speech, intonation, facial expressions and hand gestures. However, The system was limited to domain-specific dialogue generation between two agents, which not only restricted freeform conversation, by restricting the discourse, and gesture animation, but also precluded real-time interaction with a human user. Thoresen proposed. EMIR proposed a model-based approach for generating complex multimodal utterances, i.e. speech and gesture, from XML specifications of their form. Instead of relying on pre-recorded gestures, the system applied non-uniform cubic B-splines to form a gesture trajectory that satisfies all velocity and position constraints. The authors demonstrated the multimodal capabilities of the system through Max, a virtual reality-based agent that interacts and assists a human user through construction tasks, by using prosodic speech, deictic and iconic gestures, gaze and emotive facial expressions. Developed Greta, a 3D virtual agent whose facial gestures communicated the agent's emotional state. The system was designed as a BDI agent, i.e. prior beliefs, desires and intentions. A dynamic belief network, DBN, modeled Greta's constantly evolving emotions and computed the triggering thresholds and evolution of her emotions, resulting in emotive verbal and nonverbal behavior. The development of new rule-based systems often necessitated the development of a new domain-specific language, DSL, usually based on XML. Examples of these include an XML processing pipeline in the Beat system. However, these DSLs were often incompatible with each other even as the systems solved similar or overlapping objectives. As a result, a group of researchers developed a unified language for multimodal behavior generation for virtual agents, called the Behavior Markup Language, BML, generated facial expressions and behaviors, including gestures, head movements, eye saccades, blinks and gaze, for a 3D virtual character, by analyzing the prosodic and acoustic features of speech, as well as shallow analysis of the utterance text to determine rhetorical and pragmatic content. Ravenit et al. Rule-based gesture generation systems can produce high-quality gestures that are well synchronized with speech. Due to their reliance on pre-recorded motion, hand animation or carefully engineered systems for generating gestures, rule-based systems can have better motion quality than learning-based systems. Hand-tuned rules may also better preserve semantics within their limited domain. However, the gesture distribution is often not diverse. Moreover, the carefully designed rules require significant expert knowledge which is laborious and not scalable. Such systems are inflexible in that they can only produce a small set of plausible gestures for a particular speech input or scenario. Therefore, the inability to produce diverse gestures in a non-deterministic manner means the resulting virtual agents, or any other embodiments, can only behave in an expressive and naturalistic way for limited examples. Data-driven methods were proposed to try to overcome these limitations. Given the overall advances in deep learning, they may eventually also produce the highest quality motion. We review the two data-driven subcategories next: statistical and deep learning-based methods. 5. Data-driven approaches. 5.1. Speech gesture datasets. Any data-driven method is fundamentally limited by the data it is trained on. The number of datasets suitable for machine learning on human gesture data has been steadily rising, as has their size. Table 1 provides an overview of major datasets for gesture generation, and their characteristics such as size, motion format, 2D or 3D, modalities, included annotation, and more. It is seen that the dataset sizes have reached new heights of 100+ hours in recent years, and there is also greater diversity in terms of the number of speakers, thanks to 3D pose estimation from video. Unfortunately, only a small fraction of datasets contain high-quality finger motion, which is of great importance for generating expressive and meaningful gestures. There are two main methods for obtaining motion data for gesture synthesis: optical motion capture. Existing datasets recorded using motion capture are usually smaller, since that method of data collection is much more expensive and labor-intensive, and generally takes place in a controlled studio environment. Emotion is often acted. The main advantages of the resulting data is that movements are in 3D, and have high quality. This method is also the best at capturing finger motion. Datasets instead obtained from pose estimation can be an order of magnitude larger, as they can be sourced from online videos. This enables finding genuine, in the wild gestures, and the material can be large enough to include much more diversity. The downsides are relatively low motion quality, fingers being especially hard, and being limited to 2D motion only. Recent monocular video work has lifted the skeleton motion to 3D. The plausibility of a gesture was estimated using conditional probabilities on gesture bigrams, and the occurrence of the gesture given semantics from input text. The result was statistical models for an individual's gesture properties like handedness, transitions and timing, forming an individual's gesture profile. The profiles were then used to generate plausible gestures from annotated input speech. The generation process had distinct stages: 1, assigning semantic tags to input text; 2, generating all possible gestures, adding them to an intermediate graph representation, and assigning probability estimates to the graph; 3, filtering and temporal placement of gestures using text-gesture associations and timing profiles, respectively. The final output was an XML action script that could be used in a downstream animation system. Extending this approach, Neff et al., but with an additional English-speaking character. Given the annotated data, a gesture profile, a statistical model, and animation lexicon were created, where the latter consisted of hand orientation, torso posture and data for afterstrokes, i.e. subsequent repeated hand movements after a prominent stroke, for each gesture lexeme. The full automated generation phase had two distinct paths: 1, recreation that took in an annotated video as input and could recreate the gestures observed in the video, in the animation system, useful for validating the annotations; 2, gesture generation that could generate gesture from novel annotated text without the need for video input. Either path leveraged the character's gesture profile to generate a gesture script. The gesture script was used in the animation engine to generate the final animation either through a kinematic or dynamic simulation algorithm. Bergman and Kopp proposed a different statistical approach for modeling the transformation of speech that describes objects into iconic gestures that resemble said objects. The proposed system generated coordinated speech and gesture by leveraging propositional and imagistic knowledge representations for content planning, and concrete speech and gesture formulation. Their work involved dyadic conversations where one speaker gives spatial directions to another after exploring a virtual environment in VR. The study investigated what contextual factors are important in the formation of speech and gesture describing physical objects. As part of their framework, they developed a Bayesian network for gesture formulation. The Bayesian network defined a probability distribution over gesture properties such as indexing, placing, shaping, drawing and posturing. The probability distribution also took into account the idiosyncratic patterns for mapping visuospatial reference onto gesture morphology, i.e. the specific way an individual might index, shape or draw a gesture when describing a referent object. Gesture formulation resulted in fine-grained features including hand shape, wrist location, palm direction, extended finger direction, movement trajectory and direction. For the final animation, the framework leveraged the rule-based articulated communicator engine, ACE. Bayesian decision networks enabled them to formulate gesture generation as a finite sequential decision problem by combining probabilistic and rule-based components. For example, the decision to include a certain gesture or the morphology of the gesture could be encoded as a decision node, activated by a rule, or chance node, activated by probability, with a specific probability distribution. To generate a gesture, the Bayesian network defined a probability distribution over gesture morphological features, based on object-referent features, discourse context and the previously performed gesture. Levine et al. Proposed a hidden Markov model, HMM, to select the most suitable motion clip from a motion capture database, by using prosody-based features extracted from the original speech, improved upon the previous system by proposing gesture controllers that decoupled the kinematic properties of gestures, for example velocity, spatial extent, from their shape. Gesture controllers inferred gesture kinematics using a conditional random field, CRF, that analyzed the acoustic features in the input speech and learned a distribution over a set of hidden states. The hidden states encoded the latent structure of gesture kinematics without regard for the morphology of the gesture, which reduced the number of false correlations and thus alleviated overfitting. Finally, a Markov decision process, MDP, took the hidden states and the distribution over them as input and used an optimal policy, learned via the reinforcement learning algorithm, to select the appropriate gesture clips. Chu et al. Maintained the use of prosodic features to learn a probabilistic model for gesture generation. They restricted their study to learning gesture types that are associated with prosody, i.e. rhythmic movements, beats. The gesture generator was based on a modified hierarchical factored conditional restricted Boltzmann machine, HFCRBM. They first built a compact motion representation by training a conditional restricted Boltzmann machine, CRBM, using an unsupervised learning algorithm. Then the HFCRBM generator autoregressively took in the previous gesture representation and a sequence of audio features extracted from the original speech to generate the gesture representation for every time step, until the full motion sequence was completed. Finally, they smoothed discontinuities between frames by reducing the acceleration of wrist joints if they exceed a set threshold. However, their approach was restricted to rhythmic gestures and thus did not consider other commonly occurring gesture types such as iconic, pantomimes, deictic, emblematic and metaphoric. Recently, Yang et al. Proposed a statistical motion graph-based system that generated gestures and other body motions for dyadic conversations that were well synchronized with novel audio clips. They constructed a motion graph that preserved the statistics of a database of recorded dyadic conversations. During generation, the graph was used to search for the most plausible motion sequence according to three constraints of audio motion coordination in human conversations: 1. Coordination to phonemic clause, 2. Listener response, 3. Partner's hesitation pause. The system adapts motion graphs, successfully employed in locomotion, for free-form conversation gestures with a lot more stylistic variation. Their conversational motion graph was significantly larger than that for locomotion due to the richness of conversational gestures. Given such a large graph, the system balanced search efficiency and style diversity by leveraging a stochastic greedy search algorithm to find a high-quality animation, well synchronized with the audio. Statistical models provide more flexibility than rule-based systems and capture the non-determinism found in conversational gestures. In fact, a lot of the statistical principles, i.e. learning a probability distribution over the gesture data, through maximum likelihood estimation, MLE, are still useful and relevant to most state-of-the-art methods, currently dominated by deep learning-based models. However, statistical systems usually considered a limited number of independent variables based on painstakingly annotated gesture data. Learning-based models provide more flexibility through great representative capacity as well as making even fewer assumptions about the statistics of the underlying data. We describe this family of models next. 5.3. Deep learning approaches. Deep learning-based, generative models recently gained interest because of their ability to synthesize data from abstract representations of training datasets. They are increasingly prominent in character animation applications, including character control in games, and facial or gesture animation conditioned on speech and text in virtual agents. Such models typically make few assumptions about the underlying data distribution, accept useful inductive biases, and learn their parameters to fit the data through a gradient-based optimization of an objective function. The proliferation of deep learning in conversational gesture generation has led to a large number of approaches that can be grouped based on the input modalities, i.e. audio, text, or audio with other non-communicative modalities, and control parameters. We employ this taxonomy to organize our exposition and give a summary of the models and their respective categories in Table 2. 5.3.1 Audio Input. Hasegawa et al. Removing the need for temporal smoothing through representation learning of an autoencoder. The proposed model transformed audio input into a gesture sequence in the form of 3D joint coordinates. They achieved this by learning a lower dimensional representation of human motion using a denoising autoencoder consisting of a motion encoder, called motion, and a motion decoder, called motioned, and 2. Training a novel speech encoder, called speechy, to transform speech to the corresponding motion representation with reduced dimensionality. During inference, the speechy predicted the motion representations, based on a given speech signal, and the motion decoded the motion representations into gesture sequences. However, their approach was deterministic and thus unable to capture the commonly observed phenomena where a person gesticulates differently at different points of the same utterance. Deterministic generative approaches usually learn their parameters using a regression objective, for example L1, mean absolute error, or L2, mean squared error. Optimizing with either of those objectives typically forces the model toward learning to generate the mean representation of the data, producing averaged motion for different inputs, and resulting in undesirable results, usually called regression to the mean. Several approaches avoided this by incorporating probabilistic components into their objectives. Probabilistic components can increase the range of gesture motion in multiple ways, namely, greater range of motion for different inputs, or 2. Stochastic motion for the same input. The most prominent are implicit log likelihood evaluation via adversarial learning with generative adversarial networks, GAN, explicit log likelihood evaluation via variational inference with variational autoencoders, VAE. GANs aim to do implicit density estimation of the underlying distribution through the interplay of a generator that tries to produce samples that are representative of the data, and a discriminator that strengthens the generator by classifying samples as real, from the distribution, or fake, not from the distribution. Multiple gesture generation approaches added an adversarial objective as a term in a composite loss function, which increased the range of gesture motion although still deterministic for a given audio input. Learned to implicitly estimate a mixture of densities, each representing a speaker to enable the transfer of one speaker's style onto the speech input of another. The mixture of densities was estimated by instantiating a generator, per speaker, that is responsible for generating gestures that are representative of that speaker's underlying gesture distribution. All the generators were trained in unison using the adversarial objective. Most recently, Habibi et al. Used an adversarial objective in the form of a conditional GAN to refine gesture clips that were selected using a k-nearest neighbor, KNN, search that is conditioned on speech and a control signal. Normalizing flows learn to describe highly complex distributions by applying invertible subtransformations to a simple initial distribution, where invertibility allows one to optimize the exact likelihood of the deep generative model via gradient descent to apply to gesture synthesis with style control. They learned transformations from simple Gaussian distributions to the distribution of upper or full body motion capture data. These transformations were conditioned on speech acoustics and, optionally, arbitrary style parameters. Specific style parameters considered included properties such as the average hand height, gesture speed, and gesture radius in a 4-second interval. VARs aim to do explicit density estimation of the underlying data by optimizing a combination of a reconstruction loss for an autoencoder, usually an L1 or L2 loss, and the Kullback-Leibler (KL) divergence for distribution matching between a prior distribution and approximate posterior distribution of the data. The prior distribution is usually instantiated as a Gaussian for simple parameterization. The learned stochastic variables can then be sampled and decoded into diverse outputs. Recently, Lee et al. Used a conditional VAR to translate speech into diverse gestures. They explicitly modeled a one-to-many speech-to-gesture mapping by splitting the cross-modal latent code into a shared code, audio plus gesture, and motion-specific code, gesture only. The shared code modeled the correlation between speech and gesture, for example, synchronized speech and rhythmic gestures. The motion-specific code attempted to capture the diversity in gesticulation, independent of audio information. In a similar vein, Gorboni et al. In the context of conversational gesture, the intuition is that modeling the association between high-dimension audio input and gestures, represented by exact joint positions or angles, using standard regression objectives, L1 or L2 loss, discourages the model from producing otherwise plausible gestures that do not exactly match the ground truth, thus greatly reducing the variety of generated gestures. Alternatively, the audio-gesture association can be modeled by predicting higher-level parameters for gesture motion. Ferstel et al. Proposed a text-based gesture generation approach for controlling a humanoid robot. They modeled the text-to-gesture motion translation by associating words to concepts, concepts to gesture categories, i.e., iconic, metaphoric, deictic, beat, emblem and adapter, and gesture categories to gesture motions. Further, they estimated conditional probabilities to model the association between word concepts and gesture categories, and between gesture categories and gesture motion clusters that were pre-computed with the k-means clustering algorithm, Yoon et al. Similarly, poses estimations were converted to 10-dimensional vectors using principal component analysis, PCA. Therefore, co-speech gesture generation became a sequence-to-sequence translation problem from word embeddings to human poses encodings. The encoder part of the network was a bidirectional GIU taking in speech text one word, vector, at a time and capturing bidirectional context. The last hidden state of the encoder was passed into the decoder, also a bidirectional GIU. The decoder also took previous pose estimations to condition the prediction of the next pose, in addition to using soft attention used text transcripts to produce expressive emotive gestures for virtual agents in narration and conversation settings, using MPI-EBED, a dataset of actors performing multiple emotion categories, amusement, anger, disgust, fear, joy, neutral, pride, relief, sadness, shame, surprise, where the encoder took in the text transcript sentences, encoded as GloVe embeddings, to produce an encoding which was concatenated with the agent attributes such as narration/conversation, intended emotion, gender and handedness. The previous poses encoded concatenation and 3D joint positions were passed as input to the transformer decoder to generate the next pose's joint positions. The process was repeated in a recurrent manner until the full pose sequence was generated. 5.3.3 Audio and text input. An interesting trade-off exists between audio-based and text-based gesture generation systems. Audio-based generators have access to intonation and prosody, which helps generate rhythmic or kinematic gestures, for example beats, but lack semantic context. Conversely, text-based generators have access to semantic context, which helps generate meaning-carrying gestures, for example iconic or metaphoric, but lack intonation and prosodic information. Therefore, combining the audio and text modalities enables a gesture generator to learn to produce semantically relevant and rhythmic co-speech gestures. Chu et al. proposed an approach that combined the text and prosody of the speech to generate co-verbal gestures. Their model, called the Deep Conditional Neural Field, DCNF, was a combination of a fully connected network, for representation learning, and a conditional random field, CRF, for temporal modeling. For the gesture prediction task, the model took in a text transcript, part of speech tags and prosody features as input, and predicted a sequence of gesture signs which were a set of predefined hand motions. Leveraging the representation power of deep learning models for multimodal input, i.e. audio and text, for co-speech gesture generation was the next logical step. In fact, 3 groups of researchers independently proposed the first deep learning-based gesture generators that used both audio and text to generate continuous gestures, namely UNet al. Proposed a gesture generation approach that combines the trimodal context of speech, text and speaker identity to produce gestures that were human-like, and matched the content and rhythm of the speech. The model processed input speech and text with a speech and text encoder, respectively. The speaker identity was used to sample the intended speaker from a learned style embedding space. Together the 3 features, i.e. speech encoding, text encoding, and style, were passed to a gesture generator to produce the sequence of poses. For learning, the model used a composite objective, I, Huber loss for the reconstruction loss, 2, adversarial loss where a GAN discriminator was a binary classifier that distinguished between real human gestures and generated gestures. Closely related was Liang et al. Identified 2 key challenges in an attempt to learn the latent relationship between speech and co-speech gestures. First, the underlying distributions for text and gesture are inherently skewed and therefore necessitated the need to learn their respective long tails, accounting for rarely occurring text or gestures. Second, gesture predictions are made at the subword level, which necessitated the need to learn the relationship between language and acoustic cues that may give rise to, or be accompanied by, a particular gesticulation. So motivated, they proposed the adversarial importance sampled learning, AIL, framework, that combined adversarial learning with importance sampling to balance precision and coverage. The model took in speech and text transcripts and performed encoding and alignment between subwords and acoustics. Using a multi-scale transformer proposed an autogressive generative model that combined speech acoustics and semantics to produce arbitrary acoustically linked or semantically linked gestures. The key insight of their approach was to envision a gesticulation system that encompasses so-called representational gesture types, i.e. iconic, metaphoric and deictic, that convey semantics, and beats that are synchronized with acoustics. Their approach took a concatenation of semantic features that were extracted using BERT investigated whether contemporary deep learning-based systems could predict gesture properties, namely phase, type and semantic features, as a way to determine if such systems can consistently generate gestures that convey meaning. Their model used both speech and text for predicting gesture properties, through 2 distinct components: 1, speech to gest exist, a dilated CNN that took in speech and text as input and predicted the probability for gesticulation; 2, speech to gest prop, a dilated CNN that took in speech and text, and predicted probabilities for the set of gesture properties listed above. They conducted their experiments on a direction-giving dataset with a high number of representational gestures. Their experiments showed that gesture properties related to meaning such as semantic properties and gesture type could be predicted from text features, encoded as fast text embeddings, but not from prosodic audio features. Conversely, they found that rhythm-related gesture properties, for example phase, could be better predicted from audio features. Saund et al. Investigated the rhetorical, semantic, affective and acoustic relationships between gestures and occurring speech and text, for a hypothetical gesture generation system. They first used k-means clustering to cluster speech gesture pairs into functional domain clusterings, i.e. rhetorical, affective and semantic, based on functional tags generated from third-party natural language parsers. The speech-gesture pairs were refined into subclusters based on gesture motion. Therefore each speech-gesture pair belonged to at least one subcluster, based on motion, within one functional cluster, based on its assigned functional tags. At runtime, a hypothesized virtual agent would leverage the same pre-trained parsers and clusters to analyze an input speech and text transcription, select a functional cluster and from that a motion subcluster. The agent could then either choose an appropriate gesture from a pre-recorded library or the centroid gesture in the motion subcluster. Zhou et al. Adapted a motion graph-based music-to-dance system. They first built a database of audio, text and gesture clips from 3 tuples of audio, text transcript, gesture, using a splitting algorithm. For each audio clip, they generated a style signature using style gestures, for example wrist speed, radius and height, and a rhythm signature using a similar binary scheme that denoted the presence of pausing, sharp turning or a stroke phase of the gesture. During synthesis, they computed the rhythm and style signatures for input audio and text and used a graph optimization algorithm to find gesture clips that closely matched the generated style and rhythm in terms of Hamming distance, and minimized the motion transition in the graph. This model performed on par or better than motion capture data in terms of naturalness in the Genia Challenge 2022, focused on the generation of precise gestures given audio and text, by emphasizing grounding, i.e. the appropriateness of the gesture to the utterance, over gesture diversity. Their investigation made an interesting observation about human gesticulation, that multiple semantically different utterances are often accompanied by the same gesture. They thus proposed a contrastive learning framework that constrained the mapping of semantically different utterances to a smaller subset of relevant high-quality gestures. They introduced a novel contrastive learning objective that preserved similarities and dissimilarities of gestures in the latent representation. The objective ensured that latent language representations of 2 semantically different utterances were close together if they were accompanied by the same gesture. They first clustered gestures based on similarity or dissimilarity, then created positive, similar gesture poses, and negative, dissimilar gesture poses, required for the standard contrastive learning objective. Finally, they learned gesture-aware embeddings via a contrastive and adversarial objective. The resulting embedding space was used to generate gestures that were semantically relevant and closer to the ground truth. When designing 3D avatars, it may be desirable to have a holistic animation system that includes facial and full body movement. Combining audio and text modalities can be effective at achieving this goal because of their rhythmic and semantic properties. Zhuang et al. Investigated this approach by proposing a hybrid system consisting of transformer-based encoder and decoder modules, and motion graph retrieval module to generate facial motion and full body motion that included gestures. Their encoder used both audio and text, in the form of phoneme labels and MEL frequency cepstral coefficients, MFCC, and MEL filter bank, MFB, features, to generate 3D facial parameters for synchronous lip movement. Simultaneously, the decoder used speech features, previous expression motion and semantic tags to generate 3D facial parameter for expression. The motion graph retrieval subsystem used speech, audio and text, to find the most appropriate body motion segments, including gesture, that correspond to the text semantics and rhythm in the audio. Finally, the facial and body motion were used, to drive a skinned polygonal model. 5.3.4 Non-linguistic modalities. Several deep learning-based systems complemented input audio or text with additional information that could reasonably be deemed relevant to co-speech gestures. This included speech context, speaker style, discourse or an interlocutor's movements. Sadoe and Busso proposed a system that bridges rule-based and learning-based techniques in order to select gestures that are communicative and well synchronized with speech. They proposed a dynamic Bayesian network, DBN, which took in speech and 2 constraints to condition the generation. The constraints were: 1. Discourse function, which restricts the model to behaviors that are characteristic of that discourse class, for example questions. 2. Prototypical behaviors, which restricted the model to certain target gesticulations, for example head nods. Given constraints on prototypical behaviors, the approach could be embedded in a rule-based system as a behavior realizer, creating head and hand trajectories that are temporally synchronized with speech. In a dyadic conversation between interlocutors, there can be a lot of spontaneous non-verbal behavior that is influenced by the nature and tone of the interaction. Leveraging the co-adaptation of non-verbal behavior between interlocutors present in human-to-human interactions, cf. proposed the dyadic residual attention model, DRAM, a framework that could interactively generate an avatar's gesticulation conditioned on its speech and also the speech and gesticulation of a human interlocutor in a telepresence setting. In order to generate natural behavior, the avatar had to consider its own speech as well as the speech and gesticulation of the human. The DRAM model generated natural dyadic behavior by taking in the speech and pose history of the avatar as well as the speech and pose history of the human to adapt the avatar's gesticulation accordingly. The idea of conditioning the motion of a deep learning-based agent on interlocutor speech and motion has subsequently been used in several other works. Jonell et al. Investigated this idea by proposing a combination of a data-driven and physically based reinforcement learning (RL) framework to generate pointing gestures learned from motion capture data. Given a diverse motion capture dataset of pointing gestures and corresponding targets, they trained RL control policies adapted from directly mapped emotional cues in speech prosody into affect-expressive gestures. They investigated the use of 3 continuous affect attributes, i.e. activation, valence and dominance, for the speech-driven synthesis of affective gesticulation. They proposed a statistical model based on hidden semi-Markov models, HSMM, where states were gestures, and observations were speech prosody and continuous affect attributes. They first estimated the affective state from speech prosody and then used the state and speech prosody to predict gesture clusters. The gesture segments were animated using a unit selection algorithm encoder and decoder, where the encoder took in the text transcript sentences, inferred emotional state and agent attributes, for example narration/conversation, intended emotion, gender, handedness. The previous poses encoded concatenation and 3D joint positions were passed as input to the transformer decoder to generate the next pose's joint positions. The process was repeated in a recurrent manner until the full effective pose sequence was generated. A speaker's identity or style can affect how they gesticulate, as some speakers gesture a lot while others rarely do. Moreover, they may also prefer particular gesture forms, and use different hands or gesture sizes. Modeling such variation in non-verbal behavior can help make virtual agents seem unique and have a personality. To this end, Yoon et al. Used speaker identity to guide gesture generation that matched the speaker's style. Their adversarial approach combined the trimodal context of audio, text and speaker identity to produce gestures that were human-like, and matched the content and rhythm of the speech. The model processed input audio and text with an audio and text encoder, respectively. The speaker identity was used to sample the intended speaker from a learned style embedding space. Together the 3 features, i.e. audio encoding, text encoding, and style, were passed to a gesture generator to produce the sequence of poses. Similarly, Ahuja et al. In contrast, capturing body motion, up to and including the arms, is less error-prone because the joints are further apart and the articulations are relatively simpler. Therefore, the upper body motion as a modality can be an informative prior for generating conversational hand gestures. Ung et al. Investigated this idea while making the observation that body motion is highly correlated with hand gestures. Their proposed approach took in 3D upper body motion, up to the wrist, and predicted 3D hand poses. In addition to upper body motion, the model could take in 2D images of hands and produce the corresponding 3D hand pose estimations. Similar to, they used a combination of a L1 regression loss for the model training signal and an adversarial loss to ensure realistic motion. The learned body motion to hands correlation was versatile enough for several use cases, namely conversational hand gesture synthesis, single-view 3D hand pose estimation and synthesizing missing hands in motion capture data, and image-based pose estimation data. 5.3.5 Control input. Although control can take either linguistic or non-linguistic forms, it is distinct because it can convey the explicit design and execution intent of an animator. Multiple works in motion synthesis use control as an additional input either during the training phase or the inference phase of learning-based models. Typically, during training, the control signal is used to train the system to generate animations with certain biomechanical constraints such as posture, gait, etc. During inference, control may be introduced to impose style-related constraints, proposed a framework that improves on high-level style portrayal by using exemplar motion sequences that demonstrated the animator's design intent. Their framework was able to efficiently extract style parameters in a zero-shot manner, only requiring a single example motion, and was able to generalize to example motions, and therefore styles, unseen during training. Fares et al. Proposed an adversarial domain adaptation approach for personalizing the gestures of a source speaker with plenty of data, with the style of a target speaker with limited data, using only 2 minutes of target training data. Given a model pre-trained on a large co-speech gesture dataset, their framework could adapt the model's parameters using a smaller target dataset by modeling the cross-modal grounding shift, i.e., the change in distribution of speech gesture associations, and the distribution shift in the target gesture space. The approach's ability to identify distributions shifts between the source and target domain for parameter updates enabled the model to extrapolate to gestures in the target distribution without having seen them in the source distribution during pre-training. 6. Key challenges of gesture generation. Animating co-verbal gestures is still a very challenging problem because gestures are spontaneous, highly idiosyncratic and non-periodic. Rule-based approaches generate well-formed gestures by leveraging recording motion, but are inflexible and lack gesture diversity. Additionally, the hand-designed rules are non-exhaustive and often prescriptive, and hence may not be reflective of gestures which occur naturally and spontaneously. Data-driven approaches improve on diversity and flexibility but tend to produce marginally natural gestures that appear more like well-timed hand-waving, are not communicative and have little meaning. Although state-of-the-art systems employ speech and/or text information, they still do not handle semantic grounding of gestures properly, evidenced by gestures that seem to lack meaningful information when compared to the ground truth. Furthermore, due to the probabilistic nature of gestures, its idiosyncrasies, rich semantic content makes the evaluation process especially challenging and subjective. In this section, we discuss the limitations of the current work and possible future directions in context of the key challenges of gesture generation: 1. Data, 2. Human-like gestures, 3. Multimodal grounding, 4. Multimodal synthesis, and 5. Evaluation. 6.1. Data. Compared to machine learning applications in text, speech, and images, gesture generation is currently a data-limited field. A particular bottleneck is finger motion, which is difficult to capture accurately even through motion capture, cf. Table 1. When finger motion is unreliable or unavailable, a possible mitigation might be to predict finger motion from other information, for example the rest of the body as in. In general, motion capture data is high quality, but laborious to capture, particularly when considering large-scale data corpora. Other issues arise due to the high variation in gesture behavior. It can vary based on the individual, the environment, the number of people interacting, their emotional state, and the topic of the conversation. Some of this variation is grounded in information that cannot be effectively recorded because it, for example, is internal to a speaker, such as their emotional state, or that is rarely captured, such as properties of the space in which an interaction is taking place. But even if one were to capture or control for many of these sources of variation, a great diversity in gesture behavior and realization would persist, which will be difficult to cover in any database we can record. In the long term, if we can achieve sufficiently reliable 3D gesture extraction from monocular, in the wild online video, that will be a game changer for the field of co-speech gesture generation. It promises to have a transformative impact on both perceived authenticity and model capabilities, similar to how very large datasets for deep learning has powered recent advances in generative models for text and images, such as GPT-3. The better the visual quality of the avatar and greater range of expressive motion, the easier it should be to spot differences between natural and synthetic motion. From this perspective, head motion, which only has 3 degrees of freedom, might for example be easier to make indistinguishable from human head motion, than it is to generate convincing arm and finger motion. In this light, the achievement of Gesture Master took over as the state-of-the-art in co-speech gesture generation with the advent of publicly available motion capture datasets suitable for training deep learning architectures. Since then, a variety of deep generative approaches have been applied, see Table 2, and human likeness keeps improving. 6.3. Multimodal grounding. Visually human-like gestures is not the only goal of gesture generation. As discussed in the introduction to this article, a key goal with generating co-speech gestures is to facilitate communication, in much the same way as gestures enrich human communication. This requires gestures that not only exhibit human-like movement on the surface but also are appropriately grounded in the context of the interaction, so that they can contribute to it. In more engineering-oriented terms, systems must take many relevant modalities as input, and make use of this information in an adequate way, to obtain synthetic gestures that can fulfill the same communicative roles as human gesticulation does. This multimodal input involves aspects such as being grounded in the temporal nature of speech and its rhythm, being grounded in the semantics of the spoken message, grounding in the speaker's individual style, emotional state, and similar, being grounded in the interlocutors in a conversation, being grounded in the space where the interaction takes place, and more. We will discuss the main aspects of this grounding in order. Gestures are temporal, which is a result of their correlation with a heavily temporal acoustic modality, along with the fact that they might depict occurrences or trace out paths or shapes over time. The rhythmic nature of the gestures, i.e. beat gestures, in context of acoustic prosody has been studied heavily since the era of rule-based gesture synthesis. It is still not trivial to measure the semantic content of gestures. Hence, it is unclear how much, if any, of the improved human perception can be attributed to the semantic awareness created due to the use of language models, nor how much of the bottlenecks that exist may be removed with continuing progress in neural language models. More broadly, there is a need for gesture synthesis models to perform better with regard to semantics. Gesture is most powerful when it conveys information, and doing this effectively has been a challenge for most deep learning systems, cf. Figure 4. Co-speech gestures are idiosyncratic. The manifold of gestures performed by a speaker are not just a function of the content of the speech, but are also dependent on the identity, emotional state, and the context of the speaker. Generating personalized gestures based on speaker identity became possible with the influx of large-scale multi-speaker datasets. Moreover, in multi-speaker scenarios, they are unable to capture the variability of different speakers' gesticulation, and cannot distinguish between gesture types used in a certain scenario, for example deictic gestures for a lecturer in front of display, from gesture style differences between speakers. Fully sampling this rich combination of factors is likely not possible in datasets that could be generated in the near term. 6.4. Multimodal generation. Human communicative behavior is not only grounded in multiple modalities and information streams, but is also expressed through multiple modalities. A complete virtual agent will need to listen, observe, decide, speak, and move. On the generation side, verbal behavior generation is considered separate from non-verbal behavior, and the generation of non-verbal behavior is in turn typically broken into several smaller sub-problems treated in isolation. Head motion might be treated separately from lip motion, facial expression, and gaze. Finger motion might be treated separately from arm motion, and lower body motion might be separated from the motion of the upper body. A long-term goal would be to bring these sub-problems together, to create more coherent synthetic behavior with a wider range of possible expressions, and eventually unify the synthesis of these expressions with verbal behavior generation. Recent work has explored learning full-body gesture motion, including the head and the lower body. Another line of work has considered training verbal, text-to-speech, and non-verbal, speech-to-gesture, synthesis systems on the same data. Seems like a compelling direction for future work. This not only brings advantages in terms of modeling efficiency, the gesture generation systems will possess information about, for example, prosodic prominence without having to learn to extract that information from speech audio, but also more closely resembles models of human communication such as the growth point hypothesis, and could enable gestures that not only complement but, as in Kendon's continuum, see Figure 2, replace or augment speech with novel information. This may require even deeper representations of communicative intent, as approaches that generate gesture based on text and/or audio are restricted to redundant gestures, but gesture that is non-redundant with the spoken audio is a key part of human behavior. 6.5. Evaluation. Evaluation is of central importance both for developing co-speech gesture generation systems and for assessing their performance and capabilities in various aspects, as well as those of the field as a whole. However, evaluating gestures is challenging due to the stochastic nature of gestures and the highly subjective nature of human gesture perception. A comprehensive review of the evaluation of gesture generation can be found in. On the other hand, evaluating the appropriateness and/or specificity of generated gestures in the context of speech and other grounding information is quite challenging, especially if the systems being compared differ in their human-likeness, since that interferes with perceived gesture appropriateness, cf. the results in. To alleviate this challenge for appropriateness, a new evaluation paradigm of matched versus mismatched has recently been proposed. In this setup, human participants are asked to choose between two motion clips that both were generated by the same system, and therefore have similar appearance and human likeness, but where one clip is intended to be appropriate to the situation. For example, the motion in it corresponds to the actual speech audio in the video, whereas the other is chosen at random. For example, it was generated by feeding unrelated speech audio into the same system instead, and does not match the actual audio track. The extent to which humans are able to identify the video that matches the situation can be used both to probe the strength of grounding in different modalities, and to assess gesture appropriateness for speech, rhythm, interlocutor behavior, etc., while controlling for human likeness. We expect this methodology to gain wider adoption and advance the state-of-the-art in subjective assessment of different aspects of co-speech gestures. Another compelling area for future work is to evaluate gesture generation in actual interactions, building on work such as and the wide use of leaderboards and benchmarks across deep learning today. While subjective metrics from appropriately designed user studies are the gold standard co-speech gesture evaluation, they are expensive and time-consuming, and thus lack scalability. There is therefore interest in objective metrics to automatically assess synthetic motion, and especially its human likeness. Objective metrics are useful to measure progress during model development in a heavy compute, data-driven learning setup. A natural metric is accuracy of prediction, i.e., how often the predicted position of a joint is within some tolerance of the joint position in a human motion capture clip, but this quantity is often not indicative of performance due to the one-to-many nature of the problem. Two examples of human motion for the same speech might involve very different joint positions, and thus have low mutual agreement. Statistics of motion properties such as acceleration and jerk have been used as an alternative for quantifying and comparing generated gesture distributions. Proposed semantic relevant gesture recall, SRGR, to quantify the semantic relevance of gesture by using semantic scores, annotated in the speech text data, to weight the probability of correct keypoints, PCK, between the predicted and ground truth gestures. Furthermore, to generalize the measurement of distributional similarity of gestures, new objective quality metrics based on fresh inception distance, FID, from images. The technology can be adapted to create synthetic nonverbal motion for nefarious purposes, such as political propaganda, financial fraud and fake news. Moreover, a more unique consideration for nonverbal behavior results from people's tendency to entrain to their interlocutors. If they entrain to synthetic models they may interact with, does this have any impact on their own behavior? It is important for both researchers and developers of this technology to devise ways to mitigate these risks. 8. Conclusion? This paper summarizes the history of gesture generation, from early work on rule-based systems to the explosion of recent work using deep learning approaches. Deep learning approaches have employed a range of input, including text, audio and various control signals, and used a wide set of architectures. Most systems have focused on monologue generation, but work is beginning to explore dialogue and richer notions of context. Despite substantial progress, the field is still young and there are very significant challenges to solve. These include better datasets, improved subjective and objective evaluation practices, higher quality motion, producing more meaningful gestures, adequately addressing the stochasticity of gesture, providing adequate control over the output and matching the rich set of grounding that supports human gesture, from multi-person interaction to adequately representing the spatial context of the conversation. There is much exciting work to come.